They believed it was just an old tree, forgotten, silent, lost deep in the forest. But then a drone hovered above, its camera catching something impossible, a carving etched into the bark, weathered by time, yet fiercely alive. What message could endure 100 years, hidden beneath layers of wood and silence? Why would a soldier, facing death, carve those words and then vanish without a trace? And who, a century later, would find the meaning in a mark left long ago? This isn't just a story about war. It's a story about what lasts beyond the battlefield, a memory that refuses to die, and the heavy legacy of love. By the time this story ends, you will understand why that tree still stands. The drone hovered above the Argonne forest like a mechanical ghost, its camera slicing through the dense green canopy. A researcher named Leia sat behind the monitor in Reims, scanning footage for tree density metrics. She paused suddenly, zooming in on the gnarled bark of an ancient oak. At first, it looked like natural cracks in the wood, but as the light shifted, letters emerged. Rough, uneven, human. EW, 1918. I remember. The date was like a whisper from a forgotten mouth. Leia leaned forward, chills settling on her skin. She didn't know what she had found. Not yet, but she knew it was important. A message in a bottle, where the bottle was a forest, and the message was carved into the flesh of a living thing. She saved the coordinates, marked the image, and felt the strange, solemn weight of becoming the first person in a century to receive a message she didn't understand. Thousands of miles away, Henry Wallace, 72, spent his mornings the same way. Black coffee, cracked porch steps, and birdsong echoing through rural Pennsylvania. A widower with too much time and a quiet collection of regrets, he kept a cluttered shed behind his house, a place filled with the unopened boxes from his father's death 20 years prior. In one of those boxes years ago, he'd seen a name on a brittle envelope: Edward Wallace, his grandfather. A soldier who went to France in 1918 and simply vanished. No body was ever recovered. No grave was ever marked. There was only a profound and heavy silence and a single fading photograph of a young man in a WWI uniform standing proudly next to a large oak tree. Henry's own father, Michael, had rarely spoken of Edward, and when he did, his voice was laced with a bitterness that bordered on contempt. The message from France arrived not as a telegram, but as a sterile email with a subject line that made Henry's heart stop. Inquiry regarding Edward Wallace, Argonne Forest. The email itself was brief, from a historical research group. Are you related to an Edward Wallace who served in 1918? We believe we may have found something of significance. Attached was a single high-resolution photo. The carving, raw and deep, the letters seeming to bleed into the tree's surface. Henry stared at it for nearly an hour, the hum of his refrigerator the only sound in the room. He hadn't spoken his grandfather's name aloud in decades. His father had called Edward a ghost, a coward who ran, or maybe just a man broken by the horrors of the battlefield. Henry never knew what to believe, but this was real, tangible, and the words carved into that bark, I remember, felt less like a statement and more like a voice aimed directly at him across the chasm of 100 years. That night, for the first time in a decade, Henry went into the shed. The air was thick with the smell of dust and forgotten things. He found the box labeled Dad's Army Stuff, a misnomer, as it contained the artifacts of the grandfather he never knew. The photograph was still there, curled and yellowing at the edges, and beneath it a small wooden box he hadn't dared open before. His hands trembled as he lifted the lid. Inside, a Purple Heart medal, a brass compass, and a single letter folded many times, addressed simply to A. It had never been sent. No one in the family had ever explained who A was. He lit a candle in the quiet shed, the flickering flame making the shadows dance like ghosts. He unfolded the letter and read its only line aloud, as if Edward himself could hear. If I don't return, find the tree. The next morning, the silence of Henry's life had been replaced by a singular driving purpose. The carving wasn't just a discovery, it was an instruction, a plea. He went online and, with hands that still trembled slightly, booked a flight to France. He had no real plan, no map, just a grainy photograph of a young man by a tree, a digital image of a carving, and a single cryptic sentence from a letter never sent. He was chasing a ghost, he knew, but for the first time, the ghost had a voice. And Henry was flying across an ocean to answer its call, to finally understand the memory that had endured the rot of war, the silence of death, and the crushing weight of a century. To understand the carving, Henry had to understand the man, and to understand the man, he had to go back to the last days of his peace. It was the last Sunday before Edward Wallace shipped out to France. The town of Millstone, Pennsylvania, wore the collective silence of farewells like a heavy veil. The church bells seemed to ring too softly. The children played with a subdued energy, pretending they didn't understand what the new uniforms meant. Edward stood beneath the giant willow behind the chapel, his hand clenched around a small silver locket he hadn't yet found the courage to give. Beside him sat Anna Moreau, the daughter of French immigrants, her eyes impossibly still and dark. They had only known each other for 6 months, a whirlwind romance in the shadow of impending war, but it felt as though a whole life had been lived in the quiet glances and shared moments between them. "You don't have to go," she whispered, not as a plea, but as a simple statement of fact. Edward didn't answer. His silence wasn't defiance. It was fear dressed in the uniform of duty. He had enlisted out of a complex tapestry of loyalty, pride, and a deep, gnawing guilt. His older brother, Charles, had been one of the first from their town to volunteer, falling at Verdun in 1916 while serving with the French. The loss had hollowed out his father, leaving behind a hard, brittle man who never forgave himself. There was always something unspoken between Edward and his father after that, a silent accusation that Edward had to atone for the sin of surviving, while his brother had not. The night before he left for training, his father handed him a heavy brass compass with the family initials etched into its casing. "Don't come back if you're planning to forget who you are," his father had said, his voice flat, devoid of warmth. Edward just nodded, swallowing hard against the lump in his throat. That was their goodbye. They would never speak again. The troop train left on a grey, overcast Tuesday. Anna had tried to write him a poem, something about light and return and God's safekeeping, but the words felt flimsy and tangled on the page. Instead, as he stood on the train steps, she slipped a simple blue ribbon from her hair into his coat pocket. "So, you don't get lost," she said, her voice steady. She didn't cry. Edward would remember that more than anything else. Not the steam hissing from the engine, not the forced cheers from the crowd, just her dry, dark eyes locked on his as the train began to pull away, as if she were daring him to live. In his heart, in that moment, he felt his love for her settle into something permanent, something he could carve into memory like initials into the bark of a tree. Months passed in a blur of mud and thunder and the constant low-grade hum of fear. The Argonne forest was a different planet, a place where trees stood like tombstones and men disappeared into the fog. Their names shouted once, and then never answered again. Edward learned to stop writing home. His letters always felt like a lie. What could he possibly say that was true? That he missed the taste of fresh bread, that the sky groaned at night from the artillery, that his hands wouldn't stop shaking after the first time he had to fire his rifle at another human being? The silence felt more honest. But one day, a French liaison officer handed him a folded scrap of paper retrieved from a wounded soldier's pack. It was a letter addressed to his family, and on the return address it read, "From Anna Wallace." Dirty, he stared at the name for long minutes. In her heart, she had already taken his. He never mailed the reply he wrote that night. It was the letter Henry would find a century later. In it, he confessed that if he didn't survive, there was a place, an ancient oak tree near the southern edge of the forest, where he would leave something for her, a final message, a last testament. He didn't know what it would be, only that it would be something permanent, something only she would understand. It was a promise made in desperation, a message carved not in ink, but into the very skin of the world, a desperate attempt to leave a piece of his soul on earth if his body could not return. The shell landed without warning, without the courtesy of a whistle. One moment Edward was laughing, a raw, guttural sound born of exhaustion, trading his rations for a single precious cigarette with a boy from Chicago named Jones. The next, the world simply erupted. He didn't feel the blast. He was swallowed by it. He woke up in darkness, a profound ringing blackness, half buried under a blanket of pine needles and what felt like warm, wet earth. His ears screamed with a high-pitched tone, and the forest around him was silent, in a way that felt deeply unnatural, as if the world itself were holding its breath. He reached out blindly, his fingers touching splintered wood, then something warm and wet that was not his own. "Jones?" he called out, his voice a choked croak. "Thomas?" No answer, just the quiet, frantic thud of his own heart and the acrid stench of cordite. He had survived, but something inside him, some fundamental piece of his spirit, had not. It took him what felt like hours to claw his way out. When he finally stumbled to his feet, dizzy and disoriented, he saw that his unit was gone. Not dead, relocated. He found a trembling medic, no older than 16, crouched near a wrecked supply cart. "They thought you were under it," the boy muttered, his eyes wide with shock. "No time to check. We had to move back. Orders." The words hung in the air, clinical and cruel. Edward sat down heavily on a tree stump and stared at his hands. They were caked in mud and blood, and they were shaking again uncontrollably. He had been left for dead. The realization landed not with anger, but with a strange, hollow emptiness. That night, as the moon cast skeletal shadows through the shattered trees, he found the oak. He didn't know why he chose that one. It wasn't the biggest or the strongest, but something about it felt still, ancient, eternal. He pulled out his standard-issue trench knife, knelt in the cold mud, and began to carve. E.W. 1918, I remember. His hands were numb from the cold, and the blade slipped several times, slicing his fingers. He didn't care. The bark tore like skin under the knife. The words felt like his last testament, a final act of defiance against the all-consuming anonymity of the war. He wasn't just carving his initials, he was carving his existence into the world. He was stating, to God or to the forest or to no one at all, that he had been here, that he had loved, that he remembered a life before this hell. When he finished, he slumped against the trunk, exhausted. He took out the letter he'd written to Anna, the one he never sent. In the distance, the low cough of distant artillery started up again. He folded the page, placed it carefully inside the brass compass his father had given him, and buried it in the soft earth at the base of the oak. No ceremony, no speech, just trembling fingers pressing dirt over a final secret promise. That was the night Edward Wallace decided he would not be returning home, not as the man he once was. The man who had left Pennsylvania was gone, buried in that blast with his comrades. To return now would be to live a lie, to carry this ghost inside him back to the woman he loved. He couldn't do it. But war is not poetic, it is chaotic. Days later, during a hasty retreat, Edward was struck by shrapnel across his back and fell into a steep, hidden ravine. A French scout checking for stragglers found him 2 days later, unconscious, feverish, speaking in delirious fragments. He was taken to a hidden monastery that had been converted into a makeshift field hospital, one of Sotny nameless wounded men. His dog tags were gone, lost in the fall. His identity was stripped away by blood, mud, and the frostbite that claimed 2 of his toes. The monk who tended to his wounds wrote a brief, poignant entry in the monastery's logbook. He speaks of trees, of a woman named Anna, of memory. He repeats the word remember again and again, as if in prayer. But by the time Edward was well enough to speak coherently, the trauma had sealed his memories away. He knew his own name, but the details of his life, his hometown, his unit, his family, were a fog. The Red Cross could never match his face to a name on their lists. No one came to claim him, no letters arrived, and Edward, half awake in a world he no longer recognized, eventually stopped asking. He became a ghost among the wounded, healed in body but shattered in soul. When the war finally ended, he simply walked out of the monastery and vanished into the French countryside. The tree remained, so did the carving, and beneath its roots, untouched for 100 years, the compass slept. Anna Moreau never remarried. For decades, the people in Millstone called it loyalty, a testament to a love tragically cut short. But those closest to her, her sister, the local grocer, the parish priest, understood it as something heavier, a grief so dense and immovable it had become a part of her architecture. She raised their son alone, a boy named Michael, born a quiet 2 months after Edward had shipped out. She never spoke Edward's name in public again. His photograph remained on her dresser, a steadfast vigil, but after the first year of silence from the War Department, she turned it face down. Michael grew up in the shadow of a ghost, asking questions about his father that were always met with the same gentle, heartbreaking reply. He was brave, and he loved you. That's enough, but it wasn't. Not for a boy with his father's eyes and none of his voice. Michael's inherited silence became his armor. He grew into a quiet, watchful boy, then a bitter young man. The void his father left was filled with a simmering anger at the war, at the world, at the man who had disappeared and left them to navigate the wreckage. When he was 17, he enlisted too. It wasn't patriotism that drove him, but a cold fury. He wanted to go to the places that broke men, to see if he could understand what could steal a father so completely. He fought in Korea, and he came home with shrapnel in his leg and knew deeper shadows under his skin. When Anna died peacefully in her sleep years later, Michael didn't cry at the funeral. He simply buried her with Edward's photograph clutched in her hands, still turned face down, even in the coffin. After that day, he never spoke of his father again, not to his wife, not to his son, Henry. Henry only knew his family's history in fragments, like a broken plate he could never quite piece together. He knew his grandfather, Edward, went to war and never returned. He knew his father, Michael, never forgave him for it. And he knew his grandmother, Anna, seemed to live with her bags half-packed, as if the knock of a returning soldier might still come, even after 50 years. Growing up, Henry would often find his father standing alone at the edge of the woods behind their house, just staring into the trees as if they might hold an answer. "What are you looking for out here?" he once asked when he was a boy. Michael, without turning, replied with 2 words that Henry would never understand until much later. Everything, nothing. Then he walked back to the house, leaving Henry alone with the silent trees. That was the closest they ever came to speaking about Edward. Years later, after Michael himself had passed away, it fell to Henry to clean out the relics of his father's guarded life. In the back of a dusty closet, he found an old shoebox, brittle with age, marked with a single elegant letter, A. He opened it, and the scent of cedar and thyme filled the air. Inside was the simple blue ribbon from Anna's hair, now faded and colorless. And beneath it, folded a dozen times over, was a letter Michael had written to his own long-dead father, but had clearly never sent. "I think I hated you," it began. The words were raw, ugly, and heartbreakingly human. It was a lifetime of a son's rage and confusion poured onto a single page. It ended with 6 words that pierced Henry's heart. "You carved a hole inside us." Henry wept that night, not for the grandfather he never knew, but for the son and the grandson who had been forced to live inside that silence, that wound. Now, standing before that very tree in the Argonne forest, with his hand resting on the weathered bark, Henry finally understood. The carving wasn't just a message to Anna, it was a scar left on the world, a testament to the wound that had been inflicted on them all. The irony wasn't lost on him. Everyone in his family, in their own way, had tried to forget Edward Wallace. They had buried him under layers of silence, anger and grief, and yet here he was, etched into a living thing a century later, still whispering his existence through the grain, refusing to be forgotten. The museum in Verdun smelled of old paper and polished glass, a hushed cathedral of memory. Henry stood quietly beneath a display of rusted bayonets, feeling adrift. He had traced Edward's last known movements, had stood at the foot of the ancient oak, and now he felt lost again, unsure of the next step. That's when he met her. Claire Moreau, a war archivist with watchful grey eyes and quiet, capable hands. "Wallace?" she asked, her voice soft, reading the name on the visitor research form he'd filled out earlier. "You're not the first American to ask about that tree." Her words carried a weight Henry recognized instantly. It was the sound of someone who had also waited for answers. In that moment, a new, fragile hope began to dawn. He was no longer searching alone. Claire led him into a back room, where the light was dim, and the silence was even thicker than in the main hall. "We keep private donations here," she explained. "Diaries, letters, objects returned by locals over the years, things that didn't fit into the official narrative." She pulled a long, flat drawer from a large wooden cabinet labeled MIA. Missing in action. From it, she retrieved a small package wrapped in old, yellowed cloth. "This was mailed to us anonymously in 1971. No return address. It came with a short note written in French. Belongs to the man under the oak." She carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a compass, brass, heavily weather-worn, its glass cracked. But the initials on the back were faint but unmistakable. E.W. Henry stared at it, the breath catching in his throat. Tears welled in his eyes, surprising him with their sudden intensity. "It was his," he whispered, reaching out a trembling hand but not daring to touch it. It was real, a piece of his grandfather, held in the hands of a stranger a century later. Claire nodded slowly. "There's more." She handed him a laminated page from a monastery logbook, found in the same anonymous package. The entry was short, dated March 1919, and written in elegant French script. "An American soldier, no name, wounded in the forest." He repeats a woman's name, Anna, says he buried something before the wound. "An oak tree, west side. He remembers nothing else." Henry had to sit down. The carving was real. The man was real. And yet, even in survival, Edward had been erased. A ghost lost to paperwork and the trauma that had scoured his mind. Claire knelt beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. "My great-grandmother's name was Anna Moreau," she said softly, her voice steady. "She came from a small town in America, Millstone, Pennsylvania. She spoke of a man she loved, a soldier who went to war and never came back. She used to say he promised he'd remember her, always. For my entire life, I thought it was just a family story." Henry's head snapped up, his heart pounding. The pieces were falling into place with a speed that made him dizzy. Their families were entangled in ways neither could have ever imagined. Two separate trees of grief whose roots had been growing toward each other in the dark, silent earth for 100 years. "Then maybe," Henry said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're not here by accident." Claire offered a small, sad smile. "No, I don't think either of us are." Before he left the archive, Claire gave Henry one last thing, another weathered black and white photograph that had been mailed to the museum years ago from another anonymous source. It showed a man, thin and looking haunted, standing under a large oak tree. The carving on the bark was faint but visible, and clutched in his hand was the brass compass. The man was looking straight at the camera, not smiling, just watching, as if waiting for someone to finally find him. Henry turned the photo over. On the back, one sentence was written in faded ink, a message sent out into the void. "If she finds this, tell her I kept my word." The journey back to the oak tree was a pilgrimage. Henry and Claire drove in a shared, reverent silence, the weight of their discovery settling around them. The forest, which had once felt merely old, now felt sacred, a living witness. When they arrived, the sunlight filtering through the leaves seemed different, softer, as if the forest itself was acknowledging their purpose. The carving was still there, a faint scar that the tree had slowly tried to heal over the century, but a scar that refused to disappear. Standing before it, Henry felt the ghosts of his family around him. Edward, carving his love into the world. Anna, waiting a lifetime for a word. Michael, living in the shadow of a man he never knew. This was no longer just Edward's story, it was theirs. It was a story of a wound passed down through generations, and for the first time, there was a chance to finally clean it. "If it's still here," Henry said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper, "it'll be right beneath the roots." He had brought no shovel, no tools of excavation. It felt wrong, like a desecration. This required only his hands. He knelt in the damp, soft earth, the scent of moss and decay rising around him. Claire crouched beside him, her presence a silent source of strength. Together they began to dig, pulling away the thick layer of moss, then the rich, dark soil, their fingers gently navigating the tangled web of roots that guarded the tree's foundation. It was slow, painstaking work. It took hours. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long, golden shafts of light through the trees. And then Henry's fingers brushed against something hard and cold. Metal. He didn't speak. He simply continued to clear the earth around it, lifting it out as if it were a sleeping heart that might shatter if startled by a word. It was a small, rusted metal box, likely an old tobacco or ration tin. It was heavier than it looked. With trembling hands, Henry worked the rusted lid open. The screech of metal was the only sound in the forest. Inside, wrapped in a piece of what might have once been oilcloth, was the compass. But this one wasn't empty. Tucked carefully inside the hollow space behind the compass face was a tiny scrap of paper, folded into a small, tight square, brittle and brown with age. This was it, the final message, the heart of the silence. With more care than he had ever shown anything in his life, Henry unfolded it. The script was a faint, shaky cursive written with a pencil nub. "Anna, if I don't return, remember this place. I left my name in the tree. I left my heart with you. E." Henry's breath broke in a sob. Claire pressed a hand over her mouth, her eyes shining. The forest stood utterly still around them. Somewhere, a bird called out once, then went silent again. The moment stretched, 100 years of silence finally broken by the whisper of a man lost to war. But there was something else in the box. A second note hidden beneath the cloth wrapping. This one was in French, on newer paper written in a different, elegant ink. It was dated 1971. "To whomever finds this," it read, "I returned here. He was real. I saw the carving, but I took the first compass. Forgive me. I needed something of him to live." There was no name signed at the bottom, just a set of initials, AM. Claire stared at them for a long, silent moment. "Anna Moreau," she breathed. "My great-grandmother. She came back after the war, after everything. She stood here, in this very spot, and found the first compass he buried. She took the last piece of him." Henry sat down hard against the trunk of the great oak, holding the second compass, the notes, the weight of it all crashing down on him. "My father died thinking his father abandoned them. My grandmother died waiting for a man who had tried to reach her. And all this time," he couldn't finish the sentence. The emotion was too raw, too thick to be contained by words. Claire sat beside him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "He didn't leave them, Henry," she said softly. "He was taken from them, and he tried... My God, he tried so hard to be found." Henry nodded slowly, the tears finally falling freely. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was sacred, filled with the presence of those who came before. The past hadn't disappeared. It had just waited, in bark, in roots, in letters never sent, and now, finally, it could rest. The dim light of the archive room had cast long shadows, but here, under the open sky of the Argonne, the truth felt illuminated. Henry and Claire sat at the base of the ancient oak, the rusted box open between them, a relic that had bridged a century of silence. They were no longer just a descendant and an archivist. They were the living custodians of a story that had refused to die. They spoke in quiet tones, piecing together the final fragments. They spoke of Anna, who had loved a man so much she returned to the place of his last known presence, a pilgrimage of grief, taking the first compass not as a theft, but as an act of reclaiming a piece of her own heart. She had kept his secret, perhaps because revealing it would have meant sharing the last piece of him she had left. Her silent pain, her lifelong vigil, suddenly made a heartbreaking kind of sense. Henry thought of his father, Michael, who grew up in the shadow of a man he believed to be a coward or a deserter. He understood now that his father's bitterness wasn't hatred, but a twisted form of love, the deep, aching grief of a son who felt abandoned. The hole that Edward had carved in his family wasn't made of malice, but of tragedy, shrapnel, and memory loss. Michael had spent his life staring into the woods behind their house, not looking for answers, but perhaps unconsciously feeling the pull of this very forest, this very tree. The wound had been passed down from father to son, an invisible inheritance of pain. Henry realized that his journey here wasn't just for Edward, it was for his father too. It was to finally give him the answer he had spent his life unable to ask for. Claire, in turn, spoke of her own family's quiet legacy. The story of the American soldier was a piece of family lore, a romantic, tragic tale told to children. But now it was real. Her connection to this place, to this story, felt like fate. The anonymous donations to the museum, the compass, the logbook, the photograph, were likely from her great-grandmother Anna or someone she trusted. They were attempts to ensure Edward was never completely erased, breadcrumbs left for a future generation, for someone who might one day have the strength to follow them. They were two strangers from two different countries whose family trees had grown apart for 100 years, only to have their roots find each other here in the sacred earth at the base of this oak. They talked for hours as the sun began to set, painting the forest in hues of orange and deep purple. They didn't solve the mystery of what happened to Edward after he walked out of that monastery. He had vanished into the anonymity of post-war France, another ghost among millions. But in a way, it no longer mattered. His fate was no longer the most important part of the story. The most important part was that he had tried to reach back. He had carved his memory into the world. He had left his heart in a compass. He had remembered. And now, finally, someone remembered him. The loop of pain, passed down through generations of silence, was beginning to close, not by erasing the past, but by finally understanding it. As dusk settled, a deep peace fell over the forest. The air grew still. Henry and Claire knew what they had to do. This story didn't belong in a museum display case or in a box in Henry's shed. It belonged here. With slow, deliberate movements, they placed the notes and the compass back inside the rusted tin box. They nestled it back into the hollow among the roots where it had slept for so long. This was not an act of hiding, but of honoring. They were returning the secret to the forest's embrace, a sacred trust returned to its guardian. They covered it with earth and then with moss, leaving no trace of their discovery. The oak stood tall above them, a silent witness to the countless lives it had sheltered, its scars a map of history's indelible marks. As they rose, Henry looked one last time at the carving, feeling the weight of generations, and for the first time, the lightness of forgiveness. In the final moments of twilight, as they prepared to walk away from the oak, a profound transformation settled over Henry. For his entire life, his family history had been defined by a void, an empty space where a grandfather should have been. That void had been filled with assumptions, with bitterness, with a sorrow so old he didn't even know its source. But now the void was gone. In its place was a story of love, of impossible choices, and of a desperate, enduring hope. Edward Wallace was no longer a ghost or a coward. He was a young man who loved fiercely, who faced an unimaginable hell, and who tried with every fiber of his being to keep a promise. His failure to do so was not a mark of shame, but a testament to the crushing weight of his trauma and the depth of his compassion. He had chosen to carry a lifetime of pain to spare a woman he loved from a moment of it. Claire stood beside him, her own sense of history remade. The romantic tale from her childhood had been replaced by a truth that was far more complex and far more human. Her great-grandmother, Anna, was no longer just a woman who waited. She was a woman who acted, who journeyed back to the heart of her own grief and found a piece of the man she had lost. She had held his last tangible message in her hands. The two families, separated by an ocean and a century of silence, had been living parallel lives of quiet mourning. Here now, in this shared understanding, their stories finally merged. The legacy of Edward and Anna was not one of abandonment, but of a connection so strong that it could not be severed by war, by time, or even by death. As they began their walk out of the darkening forest, Henry felt the heavy mantle of his father's bitterness finally lift from his shoulders. He understood Michael's anger now, not as a flaw, but as the cry of a heartbroken son. He wished, with a pang of deep regret, that he could go back and tell his father what he had found. Tell him that his father hadn't disappeared. He had been erased. Tell him he hadn't forgotten them. He had simply forgotten himself. But he knew, in a way that felt true and deep, that by bringing this story to light, he was giving his father peace, just as he was giving it to Edward. He was closing the loop for all of them. The silence had been a wound, passed down like a genetic trait, and he had finally found the cure, the truth. They didn't speak much on the walk back. Words felt inadequate to hold the enormity of what had transpired. The forest, which had seemed menacing on the way in, now felt like a gentle, sleeping guardian. The trees were no longer tombstones. They were witnesses. The air was no longer filled with the ghosts of the past, but with a sense of sacred peace. The story had found its end, not with grand gestures or sweeping conclusions, but with a quiet acceptance that some wounds never fully close. They simply become a part of who we are, scars that remind us of the battles we have survived and the love that saw us through. When they reached the edge of the woods, Henry turned and looked back one last time. The oak was no longer visible, swallowed by the darkness, but he could feel it there, standing tall, its carving a testament to a love that refused to be forgotten. The past had not disappeared. It had waited patiently, cradled in roots and bark, in letters and memories. Now it was his to carry forward, not as a burden, but as a legacy. Not a legacy of loss, but of the extraordinary power of remembrance. The weight had been lifted. The ghost could finally, truly rest. This is not just a story of war. It is a story of how memory survives, carved into the world around us. It is a testament to a love that endured through silence, absence, and the ravages of time. Edward's promise, etched into an ancient oak, Anna's quiet vigil, Michael's inherited pain, and the journey of Henry and Claire to find the truth, all remind us that our legacies are written in the lives we touch and the memories we leave behind. They remind us that healing can span generations, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to remember. What message from your own past would you carve into a tree for a future generation to find? If this story moved you, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever uncovered a family mystery or felt the weight of a story passed down through silence? Your voice is part of this shared human experience, and it can bring comfort to others. Thank you for joining us on this journey.